Welcome to Karen Speaking Beautiful. Help me to grow this content by subscribing my channel. Here is story of the day. I stepped outside with a steaming cup of coffee, the crisp morning air filling my lungs. The scent of freshly cut grass lingered, mixing with the rich aroma of my dark roast. It should have been a peaceful start to the day. Instead, my stomach dropped at the sight before me. A tow truck was backing into my driveway, its beeping sound slicing through the quiet. My perfectly legally parked car, was already hooked up to the rig, its front wheels lifted off the ground. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, rushing barefoot onto the pavement. A man in a grease-streaked uniform barely spared me a glance. "Order from the HOA," he muttered, tightening the chains. The HOA? That made no sense. I wasn't part of any homeowners association. I had intentionally bought my house outside their grasp to avoid their petty rules and constant harassment. A voice I already hated interrupted my thoughts. "Good morning." I turned to see Richard Holloway standing on my lawn, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He was dressed like he had somewhere important to be: crisp polo shirt, designer watch, loafers too clean for someone who lived in a neighborhood like this. But the way he carried himself told me he considered himself above the rest of us. "I assume this is your vehicle?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward my car, now fully secured to the tow truck. "You assume right," I snapped. "And I assume you're the one responsible for this bullshit." His smirk didn't falter. Instead, he pulled a neatly folded document from a leather folder and held it out like he was presenting a winning lottery ticket. "As of last month, this property has been officially annexed into the Willow Creek Homeowners Association," he announced, like he expected me to be grateful. "That means all HOA regulations now apply, including our updated parking policy." I stared at him, then at the paper, then back at him. "That's impossible," I said. "I never agreed to be part of the HOA. This house was sold explicitly outside of it." "Well," Richard said, tilting his head in mock sympathy, "the board recently voted to expand our jurisdiction. Under county ordinance, the majority vote allowed us to incorporate adjacent properties. Your house, unfortunately, happened to be one of them." A slow, simmering rage built in my chest. "You can't just force someone into an HOA," I growled. Richard's smile widened. "I assure you we can." I glanced around. A few neighbors were peeking out from their windows, watching the scene unfold, but no one stepped in. Maybe they had already learned the cost of resisting. "You'll find all the details here," Richard continued, tapping the document still extended toward me, "including your first bill for unpaid HOA dues." I snatched it from his hand, skimming the text. Not only were they demanding nearly 3 months' worth of fees I had never agreed to, but they had also tacked on an absurd list of violations. My mailbox was apparently non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. My lawn was outside of the approved color scheme. And now, according to this, my car had been parked outside of designated HOA-approved areas. "What designated areas?" I barked. Richard chuckled. "Oh well, those are determined by the board." He placed a hand on my shoulder, squeezing just enough to make it clear he was enjoying this. "But don't worry, I'm sure you'll get the hang of things." I wrenched away from his grip, my fists clenching at my sides. "This is extortion." He made a show of checking his watch. "Call it what you want, but I'd hurry if I were you. The longer your car sits in impound, the higher the fees." The tow truck driver gave me an almost apologetic look before climbing into his cab. A moment later, my car was gone, leaving nothing but tire marks in the driveway and a smirking Richard standing in its place. "Have a nice day," he said cheerfully before strolling back toward his house like he hadn't just robbed me in broad daylight. I stood there, seething, until the sun climbed higher and my coffee had gone cold in my hand. Over the next few days I tried every avenue I could think of. I called the county office, spoke to a lawyer, even attended an HOA meeting in the desperate hope that reason might prevail. It didn't. The meeting was a farce from the start. Richard, naturally, was the head of the board, and the other members were nothing more than his lapdogs, nodding along to every smug word that left his mouth. "I'd like to contest my property's inclusion in the HOA," I said the moment they opened the floor for discussion. Richard didn't even look up from his notes. "Denied. You haven't even heard my argument." He sighed dramatically and leaned back in his chair. "Fine. Entertain me." I outlined everything: how my house was originally exempt, how I had never agreed to their terms, how they were charging me for violations that hadn't existed before. When I finished, Richard exchanged amused glances with his fellow board members before turning back to me. "That's unfortunate," he said, "but the rules are the rules. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. They all knew what happened to people who defied Richard's authority. Then maybe the rules need to change, I shot back. That got a reaction. A few gasps, a murmur from the crowd. Richard, however, simply chuckled. "Oh, that's adorable," he said. "You think you have a say in this." I clenched my jaw, barely restraining myself from knocking that smug look off his face. "Listen," he continued as if he were addressing a child, "if you can't afford the dues, perhaps you should consider moving somewhere more suited to your financial situation." He smirked. The other board members laughed. That was when I realized that fighting them on their terms was useless. Richard had rigged the system in his favor, and as long as he controlled the board, he controlled everything. And that's when the real idea took shape. I walked out of that meeting without another word, my mind already spinning with the possibilities. Richard thought he was untouchable. He had no idea what was coming. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk, surrounded by printouts, county ordinances, HOA bylaws, property records, piecing together the puzzle of how Richard had managed to tighten his grip around this neighborhood like a vice. Every page told the same story, a system designed for abuse, for power consolidation, for keeping people like me trapped under the boot of people like him. But every system had a flaw, and I was going to find it. By sunrise, I had something close to a plan. The HOA wasn't just a neighborhood watchdog, it was a business. It collected dues, maintained communal property, and most importantly, owned assets. If I could control those assets, I could control the HOA. I started with public records. The HOA had taken out a sizable loan years ago to build a community clubhouse. A loan that was still active. That meant one thing, debt. And if the HOA defaulted on its obligations, its properties could be seized and auctioned off. That was a weakness. A big one. I needed more. Over the next few days, I started talking to my neighbors, quietly, carefully, away from Richard's watchful eyes. I wasn't the only one he had bled dry. There was old Mr. Thompson, who had nearly lost his home after getting fined for having an unauthorized garden. There was Maria, a single mother struggling under a mountain of penalties for parking in her own driveway. And then there was James, who had been on the board before Richard forced him out. James was the key. They pushed me out when I started asking questions, he told me, shaking his head. Richard controls everything. He has the votes, the lawyers, the connections. But does he have the money? I asked. James hesitated, then frowned. What are you planning? Something Richard won't see coming. It turned out the HOA's financial situation was even worse than I had hoped. James, bitter but still holding on to years of insider knowledge, led me straight to their Achilles heel. The clubhouse mortgage was behind on payments. More than behind, it was teetering on the edge of foreclosure. If someone were to buy that debt, they wouldn't just own the clubhouse. They'd own the HOA itself. I spent the next week putting my plan into motion. First, I contacted the bank holding the HOA's debt. It took a few calls, a few meetings, and a sizable chunk of my savings, but eventually I walked out with exactly what I needed, a signed agreement transferring the debt to me. The HOA was now renting its precious clubhouse from me. Next, I started buying delinquent properties. Richard's draconian fines had driven several homeowners to the brink of foreclosure, and with some carefully placed offers, I acquired a handful of them at a fraction of their market value. That gave me voting power within the HOA. The pieces were coming together. But I needed one last push. Richard was still confident, still throwing his weight around at every meeting, still smiling that infuriating smirk like he was untouchable. I needed him to believe he had already won. So I baited the trap. I let him see me struggle, made sure he overheard me talking to neighbors about how hopeless it all was. At the next HOA meeting, I made a show of pleading my case one last time, pretending to be a broken man just trying to catch a break. He laughed in my face. Some people just aren't cut out for community living, he said smugly. Maybe it's time you start looking for a new home. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to smile. Maybe you're right. I walked out of that meeting with my heart hammering in my chest. I had played my part perfectly. Richard thought I was done. But he had no idea that by the next meeting, he wouldn't even have a seat at the table. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread that something big was coming, though no one seemed to know exactly what. The tension in the air was thick, humming like an exposed wire. Neighbors whispered in hushed voices, exchanging wary glances as Richard took his usual spot at the head of the table, his smirk even more pronounced than usual. He thrived on this. The control, the power, the quiet fear in the room. I took a seat near the back, arms crossed, letting him bask in it a little longer. All right, Richard said, tapping his pen against the table. Let's get started. First order of business: new fee adjustments for non-compliant properties. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was his favorite game. Raising fees. Finding new ways to bleed people dry. He droned on about preserving community standards, a thinly veiled excuse to justify his latest wave of fines. The board members, his hand-picked loyalists, nodded along, uninterested in the damage they were causing. Then he turned his gaze toward me. "I see Mr. Carter is still with us," he said, feigning surprise. "I assumed you'd be packing your bags by now." A few chuckles from the board. I let them have it. Let them enjoy this moment, the last one they'd ever have at my expense. "Well," I said, leaning forward, "I actually had a few things I wanted to bring to the board's attention before I go." Richard sighed, already bored. "Make it quick." I pulled a stack of documents from my folder and slid them across the table. "What's this?" he asked, barely glancing at them. "Go ahead," I said. "Take a look." He flipped through the first few pages, his smirk faltering slightly. Then he turned another page. And another. His fingers twitched. I watched as his jaw tightened, as the blood drained from his face. The smug amusement in his eyes flickered into something else. Something uncertain. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice quieter now. "Public records," I said. "Bank statements. Property transactions. HOA financial reports. All of it's legal. And all of it points to one simple truth." I stood up, letting my voice carry through the room. "The Willow Creek HOA is bankrupt." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, turning to one another, trying to make sense of what I'd just said. Richard forced a laugh, though it sounded weaker now. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because I have the numbers right here. Your debt has been growing for years, hasn't it? You took out massive loans to fund unnecessary improvements, raised dues to cover the shortfalls, then kept homeowners in check by slapping them with fines when they couldn't pay. It was a great racket." I leaned forward, watching the panic creep into his eyes. "But you made a mistake," I continued. "You overextended. You took out loans you couldn't afford. And when the clubhouse mortgage payments fell behind, well, let's just say the bank wasn't too keen on keeping that loan in your hands." Richard swallowed hard, his fingers curling into fists. "I bought it," I said, letting the words sink in. "The entire debt. The clubhouse, the land it sits on, it's all mine now." "Which means, Richard, that technically, you work for me." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, someone laughing in pure disbelief. Even the board members, so loyal just moments ago, were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Richard shot up from his chair, slamming his fists on the table. "This is illegal," he spat. "You can't just." "I can," I interrupted, my voice calm, controlled. And I did. I pulled out another document, flipping it open. "And here's the best part," I said, scanning the pages. "Since the HOA operates as a governing body within this community, and since I now own a controlling stake in the very property it's built on, I have full voting rights as a member of the board." I let that hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. I motioned to dissolve the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Silence. Then from the back of the room, "James." "I second the motion." And just like that, the dam broke. Voices rang out from all sides, neighbors standing, cheering, shouting over one another. The people Richard had spent years bullying, silencing, draining dry, they weren't afraid anymore. They were angry. They were ready. A vote was called. It was over in minutes. The Willow Creek HOA was no more. Richard didn't move. He stood frozen at the head of the table, his face a twisted mess of disbelief and rage. His world had just crumbled in front of him, and he was still trying to convince himself it wasn't real. The board members, his once loyal enforcers, sat in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from confusion to fear. They had backed the wrong man, and now they knew it. The power they had wielded so freely was gone in an instant. I let the noise die down before I spoke again, my voice cutting through the chaos with finality. "As of now," I said, slowly, deliberately, "the Willow Creek Homeowners Association no longer exists. All outstanding fines, all ridiculous fees, all of it, gone." A cheer erupted from the crowd, but Richard's voice cut through it like a blade. "You can't do this," he roared, his face turning red. "This is illegal. You don't have the authority to." "I do," I interrupted, my tone like iron. "And you know it." I pulled out one last document, the final piece of the puzzle. "And let's talk about authority, Richard." I held up the pages for everyone to see. Because you and your board have been operating under the assumption that no one would ever challenge you. But here's the thing about being in charge, you're responsible for everything. I took a step forward, lowering my voice just enough to make him lean in. Like the embezzlement. The room went deadly silent. Richard blinked. What? I tapped the document. The HOA's financial records, once I got my hands on them, showed something interesting. There were thousands of dollars in administrative costs being funneled to a private account. Want to guess whose name was on it? The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then shut, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. That's a lie, he stammered, but the conviction in his voice was gone. Oh, it's very real, I said, my lips curling into a smirk. You didn't just bleed the homeowners dry, Richard. You lined your own pockets while doing it. And the best part? This little scheme of yours, falsifying HOA funds, siphoning money under the table, it's a felony. Murmurs turned into outright gasps. Richard took a step back, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. His board members had all but abandoned him, their chairs scraping against the floor as they edged away like he was contagious. I kept going. You bullied this neighborhood for years, used your position to extort money, and threatened anyone who stood up to you. And now, I gestured around the room. Now you're alone. He took another step back. You don't have proof. That made me chuckle. You really think I came here without proof? I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen. Hey, James? I said, holding it up so everyone could hear. How's that call going? James' voice came through loud and clear. Just got off with the county prosecutor's office. They're very interested in Richard's financial records. They'll be sending someone over soon. Richard bolted. He shoved his way through the crowd, panic overriding whatever dignity he had left. But he didn't make it far. A firm hand clamped down on his shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. James. I don't think so, he said, his grip tightening. Sit down, Richard. For the first time, Richard Holloway looked small. Powerless. The smug arrogance, the untouchable confidence, it was gone. He swallowed hard, then slumped into a chair, shoulders sagging in defeat. I turned back to the room. I don't know about the rest of you, I said, but I think it's time this neighborhood ran itself, without a corrupt HOA breathing down our necks. A roar of agreement filled the air. Neighbors shook hands, patted each other on the back. People who had spent years walking on eggshells under Richard's rule were finally free. As for me, I simply smiled. The fight was over. And I had won.